So currently what you, dear viewer, cannot see is Jen and I are sitting in a hotel bedroom room. Yeah, there we go. Bedroom. And we're just sitting on a bed with a microphone between us and we're recording on her phone. So excited to have you here with us as this is our first in-person ever recording here on Decomposing Flowers. And we have quite the tale for you today, one that I believe has been covered a little bit in media, but it's just one that I think is important to talk about, especially considering all the discourse involving women and sexual assault and all of those yucky things. So if you're uncomfortable with any of that subject matter, please tune into one of our other episodes. Take care of yourself, and we'll see you in the next episode. We're going to be discussing the life story of Aileen Wuornos and the tragic tale of her life and how that turned into a tragic tale for other people's lives. Let's get into it. She was born Aileen Carol Pittman on February 29th, 1956 in Michigan. And like I said, her whole life was this tragedy. It was basically just an unrelenting cycle of catastrophic abuse and abandonment. And typically, I don't like to give a lot of sympathy to any of the perpetrators that we cover. But because it's so tragic, her life, and what she ended up doing, I think it's just important to cover, which is why I will be covering it. But her parents, who were teenagers, separated very quickly. And her father, Leo Pittman, who was a convicted child molester, was committed to mental institutions before ultimately he died of self-exiting. When Aileen was just 4 years old, her mother, Diane, abandoned her and her brother Keith, who were adopted by their maternal grandparents, Lori and Brita, something, Wuornos in 1960. Her early lives were under her grandparents' care, which, again, was just not the best. So it's alleged that she was molested by her grandfather, and there was just general discourse in the whole house. The foundational trauma also continued into her teenage years. In 1970, when she was age 14, she became pregnant after being essayed by a man described as a friend of her grandfather.
Oh.
Yeah. She was forced to give up the child, who was a boy, and he was adopted shortly after his birth in 1971. Following the death of her grandmother and just months after her son's birth, her grandfather expelled her from the house at age 15. So it's just awful. So this 15-year-old who had just given birth and her grandfather, who was her rapist, kicked her out, and she was forced to live in the woods.
Oh.
And the only thing that she knew how to do to survive, and she had to do this to survive, was prostitution. And so she relied on sex work in order to feed herself. And after losing her child, she was just so traumatized, knowing that the world was unsafe, particularly for women, because men all her life were predators to her.
Mm.
So this aggressive mistrust of men would later go on to be something that led us into today's case. So a lot of people call her like the first American serial killer, and this isn't true. She's just one of the first women who did it. There's another woman serial killer who was technically the first, but I feel like that's something that you should never go on about being like, wow, look at this person.
Yeah, it's
Like, it's not something that we want to look at in like a circus thing.
Yeah.
But just so you know, if you're ever online and looking into this case, you might see that.
Yeah, it sounds like you'd put on your resume.
Like, she had an intense fear of abandonment, which again kind of snowballs into today's case, and you'll see very shortly. And this led to a lot of chaotic relationships, and she had a self-image of herself where she viewed herself as a perpetual victim, and she was a dangerous and aggressive woman. Her criminal actions were driven by impulse, and a lot of today's killings were a spur of the moment rather than meticulously planned. And it just gets crazier and crazier as the thing goes on. She used a lot of alcohol, and a lot of the times she would be reported to drink a case of beer per night.
Well,
When she was drinking, she was described to be, quote unquote, kind of moody. She was a little hysteric, which led to her just going on a binge for a couple of days. So she was essentially going to kill herself when all of a sudden, when she was underneath the bridge, gun in hand, ready to go, she decided, no, I'm not going to do this today. And so she went to a Florida bar. In this bar, she found something that would calm her life down. Her turbulent and chaotic life all of a sudden would enter the eye of the storm, which was Tyriana Moore. I'm just going to call her Miss Moore, which was her lesbian lover. And, Miss Moore actually came from a Catholic family.
oh,
So,
she was, like, hiding that?
yeah, this was like her first ever girlfriend. And they had a whirlwind romance that lasted 4.5 years. This all started in 1986. And their whole relationship was supported with Wuornos being a sex worker along the highways, while Miss Moore kind of worked as a hotel maid. Some of the discourse is that she would kind of want Miss Moore to be like more of a housewife figure and just like stay at home.
Oh.
But like then again, like she had to leave her family because of this to be with Aileen. So it was pretty crazy. And again, Aileen had this intense need for security and a fear of abandonment.
Yeah.
So it was really
Not working out.
not the best as far as relationships go. But, they were in love. And so Aileen would be under pretty much constant danger. If it's not avoiding crazy men or avoiding diseases, it's her own safety at the end of the day. And so she carried a high standard 22 revolver for protection in her purse. Miss Moore was confirmed that Aileen encountered violence. She had been beaten, raped, verbally abused almost daily. And these constant exposure to threats and violence was kind of normal for Aileen. She thought that this was just part of the game. But this all changed when she entered the car of Richard Mallory, December of 1989. He was 51 years old and he was a shop owner. He picked up Aileen along Interstate 75, and Aileen later confessed to what was happening, but she shot him in self-defense after he attempted to assault her. His body was discovered to be shot multiple times in the chest and several miles away from his abandoned vehicle. Some people say that when Aileen later went on to abandon his car and sold some of his possessions, there was a camera and a radar detector, and Aileen claimed that she killed Richard in retaliation as he was trying to take total control over Aileen and tried to essay her and beat her and murder her. And so this was how she justified the murder. But later on, these would continue. Following the death of Richard Malroy, Aileen continued the chilling spree of homicides that terrorized the highways of Central Florida. This lasted for about 12 months. In total, 7 middle-aged white men were robbed, shot, and left along the roadside, all killed using the same .22 revolver. The consistency and frequency of the killings suggested that initially it was probably reactive, but the murder eventually evolved into more calculated and predatory patterns, which were ultimately because Aileen was desperate for money. And this seemed to be better than her continuing sex work. This would be able to keep Miss Moore at home. They would be able to buy a house rather than just renting out hotel rooms. And they would finally be able to get their life back on track. The victims included David Spears, who was a construction worker. He was shot 6 times in the torso. Charlie Karskadon. He was a part-time rodeo worker who was shot 9 times in the chest and stomach.
Wow.
Charles Dick Humphrey, he was a retired Air Force major and a police chief, which did not turn out well for Aileen because police do not like when you shoot other police workers. And he was shot multiple times in the head and torso. There was another 65-year-old man named Peter Stames who was never located, although his car was found and witnesses described two women, presumably Aileen and Moore, near the vehicle. Walter Antonio was the final victim, who was found partially disrobed, shot 4 times in the back of the head in 1990.
Were they all the same age, relatively?
Kinda. They were generally older. I think her youngest victim was 40, and that was Charles.
And how old was she, like, during her killing?
I want to say like 30, 40, around there.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I was just wondering if it was, like, her trauma from her grandpa,
Mm.
kind of, in a way.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's just, like, giving too much.
It could also just be the people that were picking her up.
That's, yeah.
Yeah. Like it's these older
Yeah.
men. And I'm not victim blaming. I'm just saying, consent is consent. Consent can be taken at any point. Even if you're hiring someone
Yeah.
to provide these services, if they revoke that consent, that's still, that's no, don't
Yep.
go ahead. I'm all for supporting if this is what you need to do to get by and that's your job, respectful. I have no judgment here, but consent is always important.
Yeah.
So, as the bodies mounted and the media attention intensified, the partnership between Aileen and Moore, surprise, surprise, got a little more tense. Moore became more frightful after the news reports of police searching for 2 women in connection with the murders. A lot of the time, Moore didn't know that Aileen was allegedly doing these murders. But as time would go on, Aileen would show up with more and more cars, more and more money, and it's like, okay, how are you getting all this? Because Aileen tried to get jobs, tried to get on the straight and narrow, but it just never worked.
She probably thought, like, she was just, like, stealing them,
Yeah.
not killing.
Eventually, if you show up with blood and
Yeah.
things, there's a little something.
Gets to a point.
Yeah. Out of self-preservation, Moore fled Aileen and returned north to Pennsylvania in 1990. Meanwhile, the police investigation started gathering evidence and snowballing into something bigger. They found a key taken from Aileen that opened a rented warehouse unit, which contained a camera, which traced back to the first victim, Richard. And less than a month later, after Moore had left, law enforcement contacted her in a desperate attempt to clear herself of involvement. Moore agreed to return and cooperate with the authorities. So this begins the process of obtaining Aileen's confession, as subsequently she was arrested and convicted of these murders. And on January of 1991, Aileen was arrested unrelated due to a warrant for carrying a concealed firearm, and they used this to keep her in custody without having to arrest her for the murders as they were gathering more evidence. Yeah. So they were able to convince Moore that she should capitalize on the immense love that Aileen still harbored for her. And Moore broke down to Aileen and began calling her over the phone. It was 3 days of very emotional interrogation. And then eventually Aileen confessed, claiming that she killed Richard Malroy, her first victim, in retaliation, saying that he deserved to die, and continued to disclose key evidence, including locations of her weapon in Rose Bay, which Moore would again tell the police and show. And Aileen's attorneys argued that this confession should have been suppressed because the police had deliberately circumvented her right to counsel, as Moore was, being like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna go to jail, and so on and so forth. And she never had a lawyer with her. But irregardless, the police arrested her for the murder charges. And so in court, Aileen only stood trial once for the murder of Richard Malroy. The defense was built around this case that Aileen was a victim who had endured the life that I had described to you and lashed out to these victimizers who attacked her. And then they went on to also describe her psychological state, and she had been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. And there was even evidence of brain damage.
Like from drugs or?
From drugs, from being beat,
Mhm.
it could have been a whole bunch of things. Take your pick. Unfortunately, she lived a very traumatizing life.
Yeah.
During the trial, Aileen testified that she continued to defend herself against these sexual predators, but she became agitated under cross-examination, which led her to invoke her Fifth Amendment right about 25 times. Yeah, the jury ultimately decided that Aileen knew the difference between right and wrong, and she was convicted and sentenced to death by electric chair in January of 1992. Following this conviction, Aileen pleaded guilty or no contest to the other murder charges, stated that she wanted to get right with God. This could have been, ill-advised due to her lawyer's inexperience, and this finalized her fate. Following the trial, there was controversy, as you can believe, as there seemed to be this shoeballing into this everything. So reporters discovered that the first victim, Richard, had previously served 10 years in prison for a violent rape. So
Oh.
it does make sense. So this collaborated her claims of sexual violence and that Mallory had a record of these criminal crimes. If this had been searched, the history would have been uncovered, and that would have made sense, especially for when she was going to trial just for Richard's murder.
Yeah, because you could use self-defense, right?
Yeah, exactly. That would have been a valid reason. So the presiding judge refused to allow this information to be admitted in post-trial proceedings, and Aileen was never granted a retrial. It's just awful that this continued, but the public took an interest in Aileen's case due to the exploitation, and it was revealed after the trial 3 detectives involved in the case had made book and movie deals to sell their story, leading to their subsequent resignation. Although they had maintained that they intended to donate the profits to a victim fund,
They never did.
maybe they never did. So, while incarcerated, she was adopted as an adult by Arlene Prale, who was a born-again horse trader who actively sought to
Evangelize.
Yes. Prale and her lawyer became key figures in the portrayal of Aileen. Later on, she had a falling out with both, accusing them of exploiting her for her story and money, and even alleged that they were just continuing to treat her like a commodity, just like her victims. So that was unfortunate. In the final part of her life, Aileen experienced a profound and erratic change of heart. In 2001, she volunteered for the death penalty, abandoning her extensive appeals. She argued keeping her alive would be a waste of money. Her psychological state appeared to deteriorate significantly in her final years on death row. She made a chilling statement that was, "There is no chance in keeping me alive or anything because I'd kill again. I'd have hate crawling through my system." Aileen was executed by lethal injection of October 2002 at age 46. She was the 10th woman executed in the United States since 1976. Her final statement was delivered just moments before death, and it was very weird. She went on to say, "I'd just like to say, I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th. Like the movie Big Mother Ship and all, I'll be back." And with that was the end of Aileen. So, yeah, there's a lot that definitely could have been changed as far as the outcome, but as far as the legal proceedings, it's just unfortunate that her story is a one that talks about the systemic victimization and gender differences as far as women in law and as victims, as murderers.
Yeah, like perpetrators.
Perpetrators, yes, that's the word I'm looking for. And that it really highlights the failures that were executed in this case And I'm not here to say that Aileen was perfect by any means. I know in the internet there is some discourse as far as, yeah, those men deserved it or whatever. No, murder's
Wrong.
kind of not justified in some cases unless you're like a perpetrator yourself and have done terrible, awful things. Obviously, sexual assault is never good.
Yeah.
And that's perhaps killing the soul, which is the worst thing, I would argue.
Yeah.
So I'm not here to defend her or blame anyone in this case. I'm just saying murder is bad, okay?
It's a tragedy all around.
It's a tragedy for sure. But that's where we're going to leave it with Aileen's case. If you have any thoughts and comments, please leave it down in the description below. We also have a Google Doc if you want any case suggestions. Join us in the conversation down below, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Take care of yourself.